Welcome back to week 4 in our study of Hosea. At this point, I am hoping that you could tell someone who is unfamiliar with this book of the Bible at least the brief overview of what is going on. Obviously, Hosea is a prophet. He is speaking to the nation of Israel at a time they're divided. He is a Christ-type figure, and he is bringing a message of impending punishment. And that's not good news for the nation of Israel, but it should not have been surprising to them. And so we are continuing with this week doing 8, 9, and 10. Last week I thought we were doing 3 chapters, but this week I am certain we're doing 3 chapters. And so we're going to dive right in because we've got a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to get us started here in chapter 8, and I'm going to read the first 5 verses for us. Set the trumpet to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant. There's that reference to a covenant that we've talked about before, and rebelled against my law. To me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold, they made idols for their own destruction. I have spurned your calf, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? Now, we talked last week about the emotions of God, and we talked about how he has emotions of grief, and he is sorrowful over Israel's transgressions. But now we see that he also has some anger, and of course it's very justified. But what we see here is he's telling them, and he's speaking to them in metaphors. Blowing the shofar, the trumpet, would have meant there is an invasion coming. There is something to be on the lookout for, and that is really going to be God's punishment. So it is not an outside invader. It is something that they themselves, because of their transgressions, have invited upon themselves. And what we really see here is you see him make a reference to the covenant and the breaking of the law and the breaking of the covenant. What has happened, and we know this, it's kind of repeated in different forms, is their knowledge of God had become historical and traditional rather than present and convictional. So they had a historical knowledge of God, but they no longer had a relationship and an active following of God. And I'll tell you, it's causing them some problems. I also am going to ask our listeners to be studying about calves. You will be doing that in your homework this week, because what we see is that Israel seems to have a complicated relationship with the golden calf, doesn't it? They just seem to continue to do. And there's a lesson in there, because I think there is a tendency that we as mankind have to worship the things we create and the things we build for ourselves, rather than recognizing that we are a vessel to build the kingdom of God. And that is exactly what we see Israel being set up for. They were the center of the world at the time. They were God's vehicle to make himself known. And rather than building up and making God known to the others, they were worshiping their own creations. Katie, keep going for us in chapter 8 and tell us what's next.
Sure. Let's pick up in verse 7. It says, "For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind." So here the word wind is going to be related to Israel's sin. And then they shall reap the whirlwind. That's God's judgment and discipline. And then it continues by saying, "The standing grain has no heads. It shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it." And so we see that the punishment has already started from God and his judgment. In verse 8, it says, "Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel." So Israel is losing her identity, and it's as she's scattered among the nations. And we see, or later on, that in 722 BC, that's going to happen with the Assyrians coming in and taking over. And so northern Israel is really just going to be scattered. And we got to see that within the terms of the names that the children were called as well. So she becomes worthless, and that's because of the judgment that God has given due to the sin that she has proclaimed in her life. So for they have gone up to Assyria, verse 9, "For they have gone up to Assyria, A wild donkey wandering alone. So before it was doves, now we're talking about a wandering donkey. Ephraim has hired lovers. So if we look at 9, it says, for they have gone up to Assyria. And that's for aid. We know that they were looking to Assyria and Egypt for aid and trade. A wild donkey wandering alone. We know that donkeys are stubborn, and so sometimes they go off on their own only to find themselves all alone and unable to figure out where they need to go next. And that's what northern Israel really has done. They have a reliance on themselves to try to figure things out on their own, and now they're lost and alone. And Ephraim has hired lovers, and this is talking about how they have sold themselves to other nations. They are relying on other nations instead of their God, who they should be calling on, but are not. And then in verse 10, it says, though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up, and the king and princes shall soon writhe because of the tribute. Okay, so that word writhe means to twist or struggle. So there's going to be that struggle there. And then we go into verse 11, it says, because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. Okay, and so we have to stop and we have to go back and understand what this means, because sometimes when we read passages, and we talked about this last session, sometimes when we read these verses, we just skim through them and keep going. But what we're talking about here in verse 11 is, God ordained one altar, and that was the temple in Jerusalem. But if we know the historical context of what's going on, we know that Israel was split, right? And then Jeroboam, who was over the northern kingdom, he actually created 2 new altars, okay? And so one of those was in Dan and one was at Bethel, which we talked about earlier. And so the reason he created those was because the temple was in Jerusalem, which is in Judah or in the south. And so instead of still having to go into southern Israel or Judah, he manufactured these altars. And so what they're doing is they're going to these altars that God does not consider to be legitimate. Instead, we have a man or a leader who is creating these altars, and unfortunately, God will not consider them to be worthy. And so we'll pick up in 12 where it says, were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. So what this is talking about is the Pentateuch, which were the first 5 books of the Bible. Okay, so that would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You might hear of these referred to as the law or Torah. And so they would have known these scriptures, and they would have been able to go back and reference them and understand what God is calling to them. What would obedience look like to God? Well, it's here. It's already instructed, and he's provided those, yet they are not turning to the law. And so that's what we're seeing in verse 12. I wrote these things for you. You are ignoring them, and not only that, they seem strange to you. And so as you can see, they are not turning to God's law that he has provided for them. Verse 13 says, as for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat and eat it. And so parts of the meat were permitted, but they are eating all of the meat, and that would include the parts of the meat that are not permitted. But the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. So Egypt here, it's representing actually Assyria, of where they will end up being destroyed by. So they knew about Egypt and what that meant in the historical context, and that's what Hosea is telling them right here.
Katie, tell people, just in case you're not familiar with God's word, what was Egypt representing for them other than Assyria?
Yeah, so they came out of captivity,
exactly,
of Egypt, and so they are going to go back into a captivity. Now this time it will be Assyria,
right?
And so that's what, when it says Egypt, it's representing is you are going to go into another captivity that you have felt or seen before.
Right.
And so 14 says, for Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. So I will send a fire upon his cities, and it shall devour her stronghold. So once again, we're hearing about the Lord's judgment and destruction that is coming.
That's right. And you know, it's so reminiscent to me. I love how you said, highlighted verse 12, were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. If you go back and familiarize yourself at all with the first 5 verses, first 5 books of the Bible, what you realize is the Lord continues over and over. Once he gives them the law in Exodus, he continues to reiterate that in every book. In fact, Deuteronomy, as they are about to go into the promised land, Moses spends the whole entire book of Deuteronomy basically reiterating the law. And it's all of these things that you just touched on, from how to eat, how to worship, all of these things are covered. And it should be, they should know it like the back of their hand, and yet they don't. So we've seen God in chapter 4 through Hosea, like taking them to court, and now we are starting to see that he's going to tell them, he's handing down the verdict, right? Is that kind of what's going on here? And that'll continue in chapter 9. Let me read the first 3 verses. Rejoice not, O Israel, exult not like the peoples, for you have played the whore, forsaking your God. You have loved a prostitute's wages on all threshing floors. Threshing floor and wine vat shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail them. They shall not remain in the land of the Lord, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean food in Assyria. So what you just touched on there in chapter 8, Katie, what we see is that now Hosea is spelling it out clearly for the nation of Israel, that guess what? It is coming. You are going to return to Egypt. You are going to eat the unclean food. This is what's going to happen. Carol, keep going for us in chapter 9.
Okay. Do you know the Egypt thing, it's almost like they're saying this is a reversal of the Exodus.
Yeah.
That what had been in your favor is now working against you.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking about when you talked about God saying this over and over, when I was a bit of a mouthy mom, and when my kids would put up your backpack, I would say, how many times do you have to say it? 67, let's get started, put up your backpack. And I can't help but wonder if God, I'm not saying he's being mouthy, but if he's kind of getting to the point, what is it going to take for this to finally set in on you all? Well, and when we get into verse 4, what we see is that the people are guilty of what we could call syncretism. And syncretism is they were trying to follow God and work some of Baal in. And God's not going to have it, because he said you should have no other gods before me. And so they loved the harvest so much that they thought, well, if God gives us this harvest, well, maybe if we throw Baal in, then we'll really have a harvest. And God's just not going to have that.
No.
And he's been telling them that since the time they were in the wilderness. So what God says is, I'm going to remove the fertility of the land to show you that Baalism does not work, and I'm going to reverse your security. You're not going to be in the land anymore. And I think they probably had a sense of false security. We're God's people. He wouldn't do that to us. And Judah even more so, because they had the temple and they had the Ark of the Covenant. Well, the results of what they're doing, and I had to look this up again. Here we go, Katie, having to look something up again. It says that because of their uncleanness, they will eat unclean food in an unholy land. And it's called the bread of mourners. So I had to go to my resources and look that up. And if there was a dead body in a home, and we bring casseroles, it's what we do.
Indeed.
But in Old Testament days, if you ate that food in that home, you would be considered unclean. And so if you were unclean, you couldn't go and worship at the temple until you went through a purification time. So it's like God is saying, you want this unclean food? I will let you have it, but you will not be able to come into my presence. And you will long for clean food. You will long for your festivals. You will long for the sacrifices, because that's how we kept our relationship going. So he's really starting to show exactly what the price that they're going to pay. But Israel is still not understanding. And the time is coming. God's saying, it's upon you. The horn has blown. The trumpet has been sound. They're still running to other nations for help. They've stopped listening to the prophets that God sent, even saying they're crazy. Poor Hosea. He's just trying to be a good object lesson. And they're saying that he's crazy. And they have become even more deeply corrupted. But here's the uplook moment, in a sense.
Okay, thank you. We needed it.
Yes, there's this compare and contrast of how much God loves Israel, but then what a mess they've become. So look at verse 10. It says, like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. Like the first fruit on the fig tree in its first season, I saw your fathers. And I'm going to liken that to a really good bowl of watermelon on a hot Texas day.
Okay.
When you've been playing outside all day and you come and you put your face up out there on the porch and just so refreshing. That's how they felt to God. He was so refreshed by them. And then it says, but they came to Baal. Anytime you see Baal, you know something's up. Baal Peor, and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame and became detestable like the thing they loved. Mm-hmm. And he does another compare contrast in 13. Ephraim was like a young palm planted in a meadow, but Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter. They're going to face the Assyrians who will kill their children. And this Baal worship where they killed their children.
That's right.
And God is saying, this is what you want. You were so precious to me and you were so beautiful and you've become this detestable people in my eyes. And so the death of the nation is coming. And Hosea writes it in an interesting way. Look at verse 11. Ephraim's glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they bring up children, I will bereave them till none is left. Woe to them when I depart from them. Part of Baalism was fertility of the land, fertility of the womb. And so their punishment is going to be the thing they're seeking. Mm-hmm. They won't have that. They will be infertile in the land. They'll be infertile in their families. And that's part of the covenant. They were promised land and blessing and descendants, and God's going to pull all of that back to try to get their attention. So he's describing a miscarrying womb. And he's saying, even if a child gets through, it will die early upon birth. So Israel, you have all these plans, all these shenanigans that you're doing. Nothing's going to happen. It's going to be like a barren womb or a womb that can't bring a child into the world, or if a child comes and the child ends up dying. So we really get this sense of, and that would speaks to us today too. That's right. You talked about struggling with infertility, but for Israel, because that was part of their covenant, it was really an imposing judgment that God is bringing. And the book of this chapter ends with God saying, I reject you because you refuse to obey me. This wasn't without cause. God was completely within his merciful judgment to try to get the attention of this wayward child.
That's right. That's right. And we kind of see it go on and on. Mm-hmm. This is where Hosea really gets hard because I mean, I'm already feeling, I don't know if y'all, just as you were describing that, Carol, I'm already feeling the gravity of it. Mm-hmm. And then we get in chapter 10 and we just, in fact, that's one of the reasons we identified these chapters together in the same week, because it just kind of keeps going. And of course, it was an agricultural community at that time, everything. And so there's a lot of imagery about farming and everything. And now we're going to see vine. And so let's just pick up. I'm just going to read a few verses here at the beginning of 10. Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. For now they will say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king, what could he do for us? And so this is just describing that there is going to be a moment of reckoning. You know, what we have seen, how they got into this mess, is that they were not standing upon truth. They had forgotten the law. Of course, the priests were culpable in that. The priesthood had been defiled, and it was not even always the tribe of Levi at that point. So all these things, we've seen the progression of how things go wrong. And now we see that God is laying out what's about to happen. He's going to call them and tell them that they're going to be punished. And now he's describing that reaction when it starts to hit them, when it starts to hit Israel. Isn't that hard? Have you ever watched a movie where somebody has, they've been out on a spree of some sort and they're living high and large with no thought to the consequences, and then the consequences catch up? That's kind of where we see Israel right here, is the consequences catch up, and they are going to recognize they have no king to save them at this point. They have turned their back on that king, and it's very sad. Jonee, wrap us up in chapter 10 today.
Yeah, for sure. Most of you have said, this was a time where Israel was prosperous, and they, it says time and time again in chapter 8 and chapter 9, they built their altars, and they used the silver and the gold that the Lord had provided them to create these altars. And they're using that wealth to be able to create that and let them worship it. The Israelites had not been true to their word. We see that in verse 4. It says, they utter mere words, with empty oaths they make covenants. So judgment springs up like a poisonous weed. their covenant was empty. Their word was empty. And so judgment was coming. And in verse 5 through 8, we're given a brief picture of what was going to happen to those idols that Israel had raised for themselves. God was going to destroy the altars and the idols through the Assyrians. Right. Ironically, when the Israelites entered into the promised land, the Lord had commanded them to destroy those places, all the high places, all of the idols. And now he was going to use the Assyrians to destroy that, to fulfill that command. And the Assyrians were going to sweep away. We continue and we see the inhabitants, in verse 5, the inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Bethaven. We see that the Assyrians were going to sweep away the Israelites from their capital city, Samaria, and take their golden calf from Bethaven, which, if you remember from multiple sessions, specifically session 2, we learned that Bethaven means house of deceit or lies. And Israel's idols, they weren't going to protect them. The Assyrians were going to take that calf from Bethaven and take it to the king of Assyria, and it would put Israel to shame. This is what you've worshipped, and yet here it is before the people who have held you captive. And Israel would not be protected by the idols or their political alliances. Even the kings, like you were talking about, even the kings they set up for themselves would be captured and beheaded. It doesn't matter. Their trust was misplaced. I think you spoke to that a little bit in your chapters. They didn't put their trust in the God that created them, the God that called them out into himself. And he was the one, I think of multiple stories in the Bible where God was the one that would defeat and the enemies that came up against Israel. When they took over the promised land time and time again, the Lord was the one who went before them. I think of the Gideon in Judges 7. Gideon started with 32,000 men, and the Lord dwindled it down to 300
That's right.
men, so that they would know that the Lord was the one who defeated the battle and got the victory, not man.
Yes.
And talks about verse 13. I want to read it for you. 13 just kind of sums it up in, hey, this is what you've done. You have plowed iniquity. You have reaped injustice. And you have eaten the fruit of lies because you have trusted in your own ways and in the multitude of your warriors. Paul in Galatians 6:7, I'm reading the NIV version. It reminds us, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows.
That's right.
Because of the great evil with which they sowed, they will reap judgment through destruction and captivity. And after these verses, I kept thinking, what am I putting my trust in?
That's right.
Just a personal application like these verses specifically, just for me personally, what am I putting my trust in? I remember in one of the sessions, I think it was last week, you said that control. We like to have that control, and the Israelites did everything they could to have control. They built up idols and wanted that prosperity and wanted that protection, and they worshipped so that they could be secure.
Right.
They put their trust in that instead of their God. So for me, what am I putting my trust in?
Right.
My heart just, got me.
Absolutely. Well, just realizing that all of the prosperity that they were experiencing did come from the Lord. You have to remember that what he had told them, when they go into this promised land, they are coming from 40 years in the desert where they have been sustained by manna. They were not able to grow anything. It was a struggle for them to even eat. And then we see that God tells them, I'm going to give you this promised land that's flowing with milk and honey. I am going to tend to that land myself. And so had they been able to remember what God had told them going in, all of it had come to fruition. They were experiencing some prosperity. The land was fertile. God had provided, but they, just like Hosea, we saw that in session 1. If you remember back to session 1, where we see, and Hosea is set up as a parable to the nation of Israel, we see that Gomer, who represents the Israelites, actually chooses the prostitute's wages as if it is these lovers that are providing for her, not knowing that it was Hosea himself that had gone over and dropped off these supplies and these resources. And it's just like that. Yes, they have had prosperity, but they are worshiping the wrong one for that prosperity. I think your application point is just beautiful, Jonee, and I do think that is a correct application for us. What are you putting your trust in? Where is it that God has provided something for you that you have not acknowledged that He is the giver of all good gifts, that everything that you have been gifted with has come from Him? Where is that for all of us? I think that's a wonderful word as we go into these final few chapters. We've only got 4 left. And there are going to be some things that maybe surprise us a little bit. I think next week is probably one of my favorites. Chapter 11 of all of them is probably my favorite in the book of Hosea. So I'm excited for us to get to that next week. But this week, as you study these 3 chapters that are hard, they're hard to study. I just pray that the gravity of that and the decisions of the Israelites would weigh on us as believers in Christ, and that we would seek to be reflective of what it is that our trust is being placed in. And so, as always, dig deep and study hard. We'll see you next week.